I'm on several lists, email and Facebook and such like. And on that list, there's a lot of different people. And on some of the lists, there's quite a few different preachers. And one of the things that I've noticed during presidential election years, those lists become very volatile. And everybody has an opinion, and they're proud of it, and they're more than glad to share it with you. You don't even have to ask what they think. And as soon as they voice their opinion, there'll be 10 responses, and then it just turns nasty. And this happens over and over and over again. And yet the Bible does speak, at least in about 3 passages in the New Testament, concerning government. And we're going to study one of them tonight. A parallel passage is found over in 1 Peter. And then Jesus made a couple comments about the relationship of disciples to the Roman government, if you will. So what we just read is, every person, that means you, that means me. Every person is to be submissive, that is, in subjection to the governing authorities. I'll come back to that in a minute. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority has opposed the very ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what's good, and you will have praise from the same. For it, the government, the authority, is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do that which is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also because of conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render unto all what is due them. Tax, to whom tax. Custom, to whom custom. Fear, or reverence, or respect, for those fear. And honor, to whom honor. So the problem comes is, what do you do when you disagree with the authorities? And we all do. There comes a point in your life where the government will say you must do something, and you feel maybe very strongly about the other one. Now, I can give you several examples. When King George says you're going to pay taxes on tea, and some of the Americans said, we're not going to do that. And we cast off the authority of the king and established our own government. And then we wrote an apology, an explanation. When in the course of due events it becomes necessary to severance yourself from, and I'm going, that would be hard to put into Romans chapter 13. That's just my take on that. Or when we had the Civil War, that there were certain things of what was going on, and parts of our country decided we'll start a new country. And I find that difficult to try to put into Romans chapter 13. So there's lots of things I don't know how to answer, and lots of questions. And if you want to talk with me sometime, here's the rule. I get to ask questions too, and we'll do it that way. But in our own country, there has been a history of 61 assassinations that were politically motivated. Not very many. 4 of them presidential. Why? They disagreed with the programs and the governing bodies. Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, William McKinley, and John F. Kennedy. Now, that's pretty tame because you go back to the Roman era, and the way they changed out emperors was you killed him. And then you had a free-for-all fighting to see who got to be the next emperor on that. And so Julius Caesar was assassinated, Caligula was assassinated, Nero was assassinated, Domitian was assassinated, and I'll be honest with you, 3 out of the 4 of those probably deserved it. But that was the way their government, it made no provision for changing, for getting a different rule, different emperor for that. So what Paul writes, and I want to tell you, remember one thing. He wrote when Nero, one of the worst emperors ever, was on the throne. And he wrote Romans 13 while he was on the throne as the emperor. But you go back into the Old Testament, and God chose Israel as a nation of people. He made them into a nation, and this was a covenant that he made with Israel. I know we've been told that the Old Testament covenant, the Mosaical covenant, was binding upon everybody, and the truth is it wasn't. It was made with Israel. And in that covenant, God was their king. Remember when they asked for a king? And God told Samuel, they've not rejected you, they've rejected me from ruling over them. God was their king. He is the King of kings, the king over the whole universe, the ruler over the universe. He was the ruler over Israel. And he gave them a law. Now that law had a lot of religious obligations to it, but it also was their civil rules. And so a lot of the rules that they had pertained to simply how to treat your neighbor, property rights, what to do if you find his cow in a ditch, all of these things. We call those civil rules because people need rules. We have to have guidelines. We have to have a way. If you ever get to go over to Europe and you get to rent a car, I'm going to tell you, be very careful. They don't drive on the right side of the road. Or do they drive? No. So as you begin talking about that, but here's the question that I've seen not asked very often, but it should be. If that's what God did with Israel, what was he doing with the rest of the world? He was the ruler over the Sumerian Empire, over the Phoenician Empire, over the Persian Empire. He was ruler over China, even though it never gets mentioned except way, way back in the earliest part of Genesis. And what happened was, and he gave them government. Not a particular government, he gave them government. And so as we begin looking at that, this was over all of the various empires that have ever existed. They had rules. They had law. There were things that were wrong, things that were punishable, and things that were right. And so Egypt and Sumeria and China, even the Canaanites, God expected the Canaanites to live in a certain right way, which when they didn't, he brought wrath upon them. Now, when you talk about this, what you see is God is utterly in control at all times. It's his universe. He allows you free choice. Did y'all realize you had a choice whether to come tonight? And the truth of the matter is, across our country, there are brethren that chose not to. And God allows such choice. Doesn't mean he likes it. Doesn't mean he agrees with it. But we are allowed to do that. And then we have to give an answer for that. God then allows us to do things which he neither desires nor condones. And that's also true with governments. There are governments that God does not approve of. They go contrary to things that are right. And throughout the Bible, they all had some type of government. It's just absolutely amazing when you go through there. But we're talking now about the principle of government, not the style of government. And so as we do that, there are democratic forms. And there's direct democracy, which was in ancient Greece. There's the representative democracy, which we have in our country. There's constitutional monarchs, which they have in England. And then there's non-democratic governments, authoritarian, Stalin, Hitler, totalitarian, Pol Pot, Mao, oligarchy, technocracy, theocracy, dictatorship, absolute monarchy. I was going to put idiosyncrasies, but I was going to leave that part out of there. But then there were others, the communists, there were our colonial government, there were aristocratic, there was feudalism back in the Middle Ages. Now I want you to see, when Paul said, there is no authority except that which God has given, these have all been authorities. And that means God allowed such. And He allowed it for a particular purpose. Some are better than others. I'm going to tell you, as many problems as we have, I like our problems better than the rest of the world's. But when I go to China and I'm talking with the brethren over there, what happens over there is they live underneath the communist regime and they don't like it. So many of the people that I've talked with, they understand this is what it is. What can we do about it? And my answer is submit. And so somebody said, do you think they ever are monitoring you and taping you and recording your Bible classes? And I said, I hope so. Maybe they'll learn something. And second of all, in all of our classes, when this comes up, and it does, because we have a lot with Bible, with college students, and we have to tell them this. And they have the same rule as a Christian as I do. Their country is different. And I'm going to tell you, if you're a Christian in Iran or Iraq, this is just difficult. It is hard to swallow, let alone hard to do, because it's so oppressive against what you would want to do. But these are all forms of government that God has allowed throughout the centuries and centuries that we have existed. So there's two major concerns I want to point out tonight, and that is, most of the time, what we're really concerned about is who gets to make the rules. And what rules are they going to make? And so, I don't know whether you've noticed this. Since I've been allowed to vote, we'll get 4 years of one party, and then we switch, and 4 years of the other party, and then we switch back, and 4 years of this one, and we go back and forth. And every time it happens, it's happening again, the new president changes all of the rules, and the people, well, that's what the last one did. And that's the one before him did. And so this is the way government in our country works. And we're concerned about who gets to make the rules. And I could solve all of that. Just let me make them. And so we're already in trouble on that. But you know, probably the bigger problem, who spends the money? And what are they going to spend it on? For what type of programs? How big should government be? How much of a safety net should government provide for people? Should it provide for people who are lazy? Should it provide for people that... And the answer is, that's what government decides. And you all have an opinion on that. So do I. How much are they going to spend on all of these programs? And I'm going to be honest with you, you don't have a clue how much $19 trillion is. It's a number. But it's a number that you and I would never be able to wrap our heads around as far as actual money involved. You know, I know what it costs to have Starbucks coffee. I can wrap my head around that one. Hard time on the coffee part, but the price. But these are numbers, and they come up with them. So this is what causes so much animosity and division among brethren. And you have an opinion, and you need to have an opinion. You need to have a guided opinion, a studied opinion about these. But recognize that's your opinion. And there's going to be people that disagree with you. I memorized something when I first started preaching because I found out people kept saying that they disagreed with me. And you know the funny thing, when they disagreed with me, I disagreed with them. It's not really a funny thing. Obviously, the disagreement runs both directions on this. And so it is on all of our political discussions. So as we go through this, God has used government, all different kinds of governments. And He has used bad governments to accomplish His purposes. For example, He used Babylon to destroy the northern 10 tribes when they were ungodly. He then used the Persians to destroy the Babylonians. And He used Alexander the Great in order to bring about a unified empire with a common language. And so Jesus came at the appropriate time with what providence had provided for that. And so God raised up governments, and God tore down governments. God established, and governments had a purpose. And when they ceased to function for God's purpose, He did and could and will cause them to go away, destroyed or otherwise. Now, as we look at this, I'm going to suggest three things. Number one, I'm going to be talking about principles and not application. We pay taxes. That's a principle. How much? That's application. We come back from China and you have to go through customs. And if you have certain things, you have to pay custom. That's different than a tax. Still comes out of your pocket, but it's called in a different thing. How much? And again, this is the application is the how much. Paying custom or tax is the principle. Then, as you study and think about these, you have to use the Bible and not history. How previous governments functioned is not my relationship with the current government, and I can't decide that. And likewise on that, we are stuck. I've told brethren over and over again, I wished I could make some more trips to China and stuff you in my suitcase. I'd like you to come with me to see what they have to deal with and how they deal with that, and the differences that are there in their culture, the differences not just in the language, but how they treat one another. I know when I first got there, I was introduced to this gal, and she was very friendly, and so I just walked over and I gave her a big hug. And I could just feel the tension. I may have been the first person that had ever hugged her publicly in her whole life, because I learned they don't do that. They learned I do that. And over the course of the time. But there were lots of customs that they had that we simply don't have over here. And there may or may not have been good reasons for that. So our American viewpoint, what you have grown up with, what you have seen and practiced in your life, that is our government. That is the application of our government. That is not God's way. And so as we begin looking at this, government was established by God. And what I mean by that is the rule of governing and for a principled order in society. Drove me nuts when I was in California because they had all of these codes that you had to live by. So if you lived in a particular area, there's all these things you could not do. And then my dad lived here in Texas, and the neighborhood that he lived in, there was a nice big housing development, then there was an even richer housing development, and then there was a chicken farm. And on the other side, there was a ammunition development country. And you're going, wait a minute. How can all of these exist next to one another? In California, they wouldn't allow that. And in Texas, we decided, okay, you make your own rule on that. And that's well and good until your neighbor decides to be a chicken farm. And then you wish that there were some rules, some authority that goes on. That's the purpose of government, is simply to provide for us rules. We all drive on the right side of the road. But in England and Hong Kong, they drive on the left side of the road. And you know, it doesn't matter if you're driving on the right side here and the left side there. But if you decide to drive on the right side there and the left, it matters altogether. We have speed limits. We have stop signs. We have yield signs. We have, well, those are for our getting along with one another. Do you like them? You know, a few years ago, Texas decided to lower the speed limit at night down to 65. And whoa, after you've been driving 80, 85 on some of our roads, and then all of a sudden the sun goes down another inch and it's 65. And it's a snail pace. I never liked it. But what you do is you abide by the laws of the land that you live under. And so, if you don't have that, everybody decides to drive as fast as they want, stop when they want, don't stop when they want, drive on any side of the road that they want to, and it's called anarchy. And if you want to read about anarchy, read the book of Judges. Last verse, every man did what was right in his own eyes, and it was a mess. It was absolute terrible. So we have rules. And the rules are designed for good. Now, he's going to use good and evil here. And that is not a designation of universal moral code. Sometimes we think of that. But it's not. It's good for the people that they're governing over. And it only goes that far. And it's evil. They decide what is evil for society that they're governing over. So as you go from country to country to country, 195 different countries. CIA said there's 216, and I don't know what the real number is. But they all have a government, and they all make these rules. And so as you go from one to another, they decide what they say is good for their country. And you may not agree with that. But if you're part of that country, you submit under their rule. That's what it says. And it says he is a minister. That's the same word as deacon, diakonos. And it is a deacon for God. That's how God chooses today to regulate good in our societies. And so we have our government. Canada has theirs, Mexico has theirs, and we all have different rules. Part of that is because we have different customs, different ideas, different lots of things. And so what is good for our country is to be decided by the government from that. Now, I'm going to tell you, one of the things we have a good advantage for, we can vote on it. And so if we decide we don't like it, we do have the option. But in most countries, that is not an option. So, a minister for good, for the safety and the peace of the people that are being governed. That's the purpose for that. Not a universal code. They're not deciding what God determines good or evil. It's just in relationship to this government. So, they're also a minister to punish, an avenger, if you will, upon evil. If you want to not fear, do what's good. If you want to fear, go ahead and do that which the government says is evil. So, how do we define that? Who gets to make those rules? And in our country, we have Congress and we have Senate, and then we have the Supreme Court, and we have this triple set up that helps govern each other and keep things somewhat in semblance. And that's worked really pretty well for 200 years. You may not like all of it, but it's worked fairly well on this. So who defines? And the answer is the government defines what is good for the people that are being governed, and it defines that which is evil for the peace and safety of the people that are being governed. Now, how are they going to enforce that? I've had a statement for years. A law without a penalty is just a suggestion. It's not a law. And a law where the penalty is not enforced is just a suggestion. It's not a law. And so what we have is governments make laws, and they associate a penalty. And sometimes you'll hear this, maybe you've even said that. Well, we realize that penalties don't work. Punishment doesn't deter crime. It does. Why do we have parking tickets? Why do we have speeding tickets? And why do we get penalized if we don't pay the proper taxes on it? Because we found out it does deter crime and helps people do that. It's usually just some great big thing, like murder, that they think that it doesn't work. Now, how about this? The government punishes evil, but it decides that even up to the point of bearing the sword. And what did they use swords for? Peeling potatoes? And the answer is no. Swords were used primarily as an executioning instrument or a war instrument to kill the other side. So that was what the government does. And the government should do that from a sense particularly of the value of life. And that's not often done anymore. We've devalued life. You can get a greater jail prison for stuff with money in a white-collar crime than you can for murder. And we've got things out of balance. That's my opinion. Feel free to argue with me. I'll listen all night long if you want. But the government decides that we should value life. One of the things that we ought to have is consistency. And do you all realize we don't? That's what we've complained about for years and years and years and years. The rich people get away with it, and the poor people don't get away with it. Probably true in lots of different areas. Should it be true? Absolutely not. But that's how that works. So what we want and what you get to vote on is, let's argue for the consistency across the board, fair and equitable to everybody. And that will provide for any country, anywhere, to have peace and safety of its members and of its people. But it doesn't happen. Every government, including ours, fails to some degree in all of these. Always has. Always will. Because we have 350 million people in our country, and there are a whole bunch of differences on that. So what is my response to all of this? Remember, We're dealing with principles. That's what Paul deals with here. And not the specific applications of these things. And so the first thing, every soul, every disciple, regardless of what country they live in, regardless of what era they lived in, every disciple has had the same obligation, and that is, it means that you have to apply this. So, if somebody listens to this on YouTube and doesn't like what I say, that's their choice, and they get to make it, and they will give an answer to God for how that is given and how they live by it. So, it's individually applied, and what it tells us is that we are to submit. Number one, submit does not mean that you agree. Wives are to submit unto their husbands, and I guarantee you, that doesn't mean the wives always agree to what the husband's idea is. In fact, I would argue submit means there's a disagreement here. There's their idea and there's my idea. And one of us has to submit. And what Paul says here, in my relationship with the government, I am to be submissive. I am to submit. That is used in every relationship that God gives. It's relationship to the elders of the congregation. It's relationship of the wife to the husband. It is relationship to the children, to the fathers. It is the relationship of the slave unto the master. It is the relationship of Christ as the Son unto God the Father when He was here. And so this has worked in every relationship. And in every relationship, there's always some chafing that goes on when you're the one that has to submit. You have to give up your ideal, your concept, and live underneath this one. By the way, the opposite side of that, Brendan, I hope you bring this out next week on husbands and wives. The husband, as the head of the house, is a responsibility. Main responsibility. A responsibility to God on how He behaves. So we are to submit. And then twice, He says, don't resist. You know, the Roman time, Jesus addressed this. The Romans had, because they were an occupation army, they could come up to you and they could say, here, I need this load carried over there. And you look and it's 2 miles down the road. And you were required to take it 1 mile. And Jesus said, here's what you do. You pick it up and you take it. And when you get to the end of the mile, you carry it another mile for them. And I'm having trouble with the first mile here. So when we talk about submission and not resisting, it is not to argue that I don't have to do that. This is what they've asked us to do. And in every relationship, you see that. And it's not something that necessarily is inherently moral or immoral. It's just the position of life, the authority, the submission to the one that is above you. Y'all done this at work? Sometimes. The boss says do this, and you submit because it's his position. Having said that, every time I've taught this, somebody always brings it up. So I've just learned I bring it up ahead of time. I understand when it demands of you doing something that God said don't do, then you don't do it. Because our duty is to God. I will be honest with you, I've not run into that in my relationship with the government here, demanding of me things to do. If you have a few, that's fine. I'm sure there are some somewhere that I didn't meet. But be very careful with this. You're not liking it does not make it immoral. It just means you don't like that. But for example, in this one in Acts chapter 4, the apostles were under the commission of the Lord. Go and preach the gospel to every creature. And the Roman judge or the Jewish judges said, You can't preach anymore. And that's when Peter said, well, you decide, but as for us, we're going to obey God rather than man. Well, I don't like the tax rate, so I'm not going to pay it. No, that's not your choice. I don't like the speed limit, so I'm going to drive faster. It's not my choice. And so on these things, we obey the governments, except where it will violate what God has ordained for us to do. And in our country, there's not going to be much. If you lived in India or Iraq, there may be a lot of those things. But here, not so much. Principles for us. As much as you don't like it, you obey. You submit. You don't resist what they're doing. Second of all, for a government to carry out its duties requires that they have some money to pay for all of the things that they're trying to do. It just takes money. And God simply says, as a citizen, I will pay taxes to allow the government to do what it's supposed to do. I will pay customs on that which the government says that it needs. Now, do you all realize I don't agree with how much, I don't agree with the rate. I don't agree what they spend it for. And there's just lots of things I don't like and don't agree. But I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. I'm already working on my tax forms. I will have them ready by the second week in February, and I will send them in. As one CPA told me when I was dealing with him, he said, now you're going to pay every penny that you owe and not a penny more. And I like that. That's what they said. So we pay our taxes. We pay our taxes. Do you remember when they asked Jesus about paying taxes to Caesar? And he asked for a coin, a Roman coin, and it had Caesar's image on that. And he said, here's what you do. You pay unto Caesar's what is Caesar's, but you give unto God what is God's. And that was what they had to do. They didn't like the Roman government. And remember, Nero. Do we pay taxes for Nero to spend it? Yes. That's what happens. And then honor. And I've seen this failure among our brethren more than I care to ever see again. We don't like whoever is in office, whatever office that may be, and we feel free to simply mean-mouth, disparage, say things. And that ought not be. We ought to give reverence not for the man or the woman in the office, but the fact that they are in the position of authority. So we give honor or fear. By the way, that word is phobos, and you all recognize immediately phobia, and that means the idea of fear. But it's like with the fear of God, and that also carries with it the other side, the reverence for the position that they're in. And we need to have that reestablished, at least among us, that I will not do that. I'm not going to get on Facebook and rant and call names and disparage. We'll do that. Respect unto whom respect is due. And they have respect for the office that they do it. I don't want that job, by the way. I hope you didn't vote for me. It comes with too much baggage. It comes with too many problem areas for me. I wish we had men of high character and moral value that wanted to do that. Pray that we'd have more of that. But let's give them at least the honor and the respect that the office is due for that. And then I'm just going to quit tonight with one more verse, and that's what Peter said, or Paul said in 1 Timothy. I urge that entreaties and prayers and petitions and thanksgiving be made on behalf of all men for kings and for all that are in authority. Curtis, thank you. You did that tonight. I don't know whether that was because we had this up on the board ahead of time, but we don't pray enough. We complain plenty, but what we ought to do is complain less and pray a whole lot more. And pray for them, for their decisions. Pray that this can be worked out. Pray that our country can find a measure of peace and safety. It says, pray that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. Pray that the tax rate goes down. Doesn't say that. Pray. We're supposed to pray with our main objective being we can live a godly, dignified, quiet life. We can do what God wants us to do. And you know, we've been allowed to do that. My whole life as a Christian, all of the years I've preached, I've never been hampered in doing what God wants me to do. There's been temptations to do something different, but nothing that is legislative down for that. So this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. So here's what I want you to do. When you read tomorrow's headlines and you don't like what the government's doing, pray for them. Pray that they have more wisdom. Pray that they have more support in that which is good. Pray that circumstances may overrule whatever bad judgments are there. The providence of God works both ways, as we all know. And so we need to trust God. Don't put your trust in government. It'll betray you. It will fail you. But at the same time, we live and we have need of government in our lives. Now, if you want to talk with me later, I'm going to leave as soon as we say amen. But on that. Now, some things about being a Christian are difficult. And this may be one for you. But that doesn't mean that you don't do it. It means you have to work all the harder. It means you work at yourself and your own attitude to become this type of disciple that the Lord has asked us to be. And so that starts with, he that believes and is baptized shall be saved. Brandon has mentioned this, and I've mentioned this, and Boyd mentioned this. One of the things that is so difficult with people is they simply do not want to obey the gospel for whatever reason. And yet, that's the only way that they can be saved. And so, sometimes the hard thing is the thing that is best for us. It is the thing that will provide for us the best relationship with God and the best life as a disciple. So when you hit those hard things, don't quit. Jump in and do it. And if you've never obeyed the gospel, you need to do it tonight. And we're going to allow you that opportunity as together we stand and as we sing.